thought I was invited to the gala as a guest of honor, but standing in that ballroom, I realized I had walked straight into a meticulously crafted death trap. Before the night ended, I would be framed for a crime I didn't commit, while the city's most powerful elite watched the foundation of their entire organized scheme crumble beneath them. The crystal chandelier above the ballroom pulsed with a blinding, opulent light, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the silk gowns of the city's elite. I adjusted my tie, feeling like an imposter in a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer jewelry. I was there as a guest of honor, the youngest detective in the department's history, and frankly, I was just looking for an excuse to leave early. That was until I saw him. Officer Miller. He was known for being the loudest, most arrogant man in the precinct, the kind of guy who took pleasure in stepping on anyone he considered beneath him. And tonight, he had set his sights on a girl who looked no older than 22, standing near the punch fountain. She was stunning, graceful, wearing a midnight blue dress that seemed to shimmer with every move she made. She was laughing at something a waiter had said, her expression bright and unbothered. Miller, however, was already swaying slightly, his glass of expensive champagne tilted dangerously low. He didn't just walk toward her, he bulldozed his way through the crowd, his face twisted into that familiar, condescending smirk I'd seen him use on suspects and civilians alike. I knew better than to interfere immediately, so I stayed back, watching from behind a massive fern, my gut churning with a bad premonition. "Well, look at this," Miller boomed, his voice cutting through the soft ambient jazz like a serrated knife. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He stopped inches from her, effectively cornering her against the table. "I don't remember seeing your invitation at the door. Did you get lost on your way to the waitstaff quarters? Or did you just decide to wander into a party where you clearly don't belong?" The room went deathly silent. Conversations died out as heads turned. The girl didn't flinch. She set her drink down slowly, her posture remaining perfectly elegant. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, her voice calm, though her eyes were beginning to harden with a sharp, dangerous intelligence. Miller let out a boisterous, dismissive laugh, gesturing toward the surrounding guests. "Don't play coy with me. I've seen your type 1,000 times. You're looking for a shortcut to the top, aren't you? Maybe you think if you smile pretty enough, one of these donors will give you a handout. But let's be real. People like you don't belong at the governor's gala. Why don't you do us all a favor and head back to the street level where you came from?" I could see the veins in Miller's neck bulging as he doubled down on his cruelty, unaware that the governor was currently walking down the grand staircase just 20 feet behind him. I took a step forward, ready to intervene, but the girl held up a hand. She didn't look scared, she looked disappointed, like she was watching a child throw a tantrum. "You're a police officer, aren't you?" she asked, her voice steady and echoing through the hushed hall. "That's right," Miller puffed out his chest, completely oblivious to the shifting temperature of the room. "And I'm very good at spotting trouble. You're exactly the kind of trouble that ruins the atmosphere of an evening like this. Do I need to have security escort you out, or are you going to leave on your own before I report you for trespassing?" He grabbed her arm, a firm, aggressive grip that made my blood run cold. Before I could sprint toward them, a voice thundered from the stairs. It was deep, authoritative, and carried the weight of a man who commanded the state. "Officer Miller," the governor's voice boomed. Miller froze, his grip loosening as he turned around, a sycophantic grin already forming on his face, expecting a pat on the back for keeping the peace. "Governor, sir, I was just handling a minor security breach," Miller began, sounding proud of his own bigotry. The governor didn't smile back. He walked down the final step, his eyes fixed on Miller's hand, which was still dangerously close to the girl. He walked right up to Miller, his presence so commanding that the officer's bravado visibly withered. "A security breach?" the governor repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, officer. The only breach I see here is one of decorum and common decency." He stepped between Miller and the girl, gently pulling her behind him as if she were a precious heirloom. He turned back to Miller, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. "This young woman is not a trespasser. She is my daughter." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. Miller's jaw went slack, the color draining from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. He tried to speak, to stammer out an apology, but no sound came out. The governor wasn't done, though. He leaned in close, his voice low enough that only Miller and those nearby could hear. I've been looking for a reason to clean up the rot in my department, Miller. You just handed me the mop. Suddenly, the governor's personal detail moved in, encircling Miller, but not to escort him out. They were closing the exits. I watched from the shadows, knowing that Miller's life, as he knew it, was over. But as the security team began to pat Miller down, they pulled something from his inner jacket pocket that made the governor's eyes narrow even further. It wasn't just a badge. It was a thick sealed envelope marked with internal department stamps, and as they tore it open, the entire ballroom erupted in gasps. The governor pulled out a file, flipped through the pages, and his expression shifted from anger to genuine shock. "Wait," the governor whispered, looking up at Miller with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated coldness. "This isn't just about harassment. This is a manifest. You've been running an organized scheme right under our noses, haven't you?" Miller went limp as the security team pinned him to the floor, and I realized with a sickening jolt that this night wasn't just about a drunken insult. It was the start of a war. The air in the ballroom had turned from the suffocating heat of high society to the sharp, metallic chill of a crime scene. Miller was pressed face first into the intricate patterns of the imported rug, his expensive dress shoes scraping uselessly against the hardwood. He wasn't the arrogant predator anymore. He was a cornered animal, twitching as the governor's personal detail stripped him of his belt, his wallet, and that damning folder. I moved closer, unable to stay in the shadows any longer. As a detective, my duty was supposed to be to the law, but standing there, witnessing the governor of the state personally dismantling a high-ranking officer, I felt the foundations of my world tilting. The governor's daughter, the girl who had been targeted just moments ago, didn't look shaken. She stood beside her father, her eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's calm, identifying who among the guests was looking away, who was sweating, and who looked ready to bolt. "Check his phone," the governor commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth. He held the folder aloft, the light catching the gold-embossed seal of the department. "Miller, you really thought you could hide a network of illegal weapon distribution and intercepted shipments of prohibited substances inside your own station? You thought you were the one holding the leash?" Miller let out a wet, guttural sound. "You don't understand, Governor. I'm just a middleman. If I go down, half the precinct goes down with me. You think you can just burn this house to the ground? The foundation is already hollowed out." The governor didn't blink. He handed the file to one of his bodyguards and signaled for the internal security team to move Miller out through the service entrance. As they dragged him away, his eyes locked onto mine. He knew who I was. He knew I had been watching. For a split second, there was a flash of something in his eyes. Not fear, but a mocking recognition. He was telling me that he wasn't the only one involved in this organized scheme. The room remained eerily silent, even after Miller disappeared into the kitchen corridor. The governor cleared his throat, his composure returning like a mask being lowered into place. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming over the sound of clinking silverware, "I apologize for the interruption. My daughter and I have some urgent matters of state to attend to. Please, enjoy the rest of your evening." It was a dismissal, but the tension was electric. People were already reaching for their phones, whispering into microphones, and edging toward the exits. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I was being watched. I slipped toward the back of the hall, hoping to reach the security perimeter before the chaos fully set in. But before I could reach the heavy oak doors, the governor's daughter appeared, stepping out from behind a pillar as if she had been waiting for me. "Detective," she said, her voice dropping the poise she'd worn for the crowd. It was sharp, direct, and slightly cynical. "You were watching him for a long time before he approached me. You knew who he was, didn't you?" I straightened, keeping my hands visible. "I knew he was trouble. I didn't know he was running a criminal syndicate out of the armory. I'm just as shocked as you are." She stepped into my space, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Don't lie to me. My father needs to know who in the precinct he can trust, and right now, that list is dangerously short. Miller wasn't working alone. He was just the one loud enough to get caught. There are people in your department who have been waiting for someone like Miller to be removed so they can take his place." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. She pressed it into my palm, her fingers cold against my skin. "This contains the digital trail of the shipments Miller was handling. My father's team hasn't had time to scrub it yet. If you're the honest cop everyone says you are, you'll take this to the internal security office, not your precinct captain. Do you understand?" I looked down at the drive, the weight of it suddenly feeling like a lead brick in my hand. Why give this to me? You don't know me. She tilted her head, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. I know that you haven't taken a single bribe in 3 years. I know you've been blocked for promotion 4 times because you refused to look the other way when the senior officers were off duty. You're a liability to them, which makes you the only asset I have. Before I could answer, a loud crash echoed from the front of the ballroom. A massive explosion of glass shattered the serenity of the evening as the service doors burst open. It wasn't the security team. It was a group of men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by black masks, carrying equipment that looked far too professional for a simple rescue mission. "Get down!" someone screamed. The governor's daughter shoved me behind a buffet table, but as I looked up, I saw one of the intruders level a weapon at the governor. He wasn't there to rescue Miller. He was there to silence the man who had just dismantled their operation. As the first shot rang out, tearing through the crystal chandelier and showering the room in shards of glass, I realized the drive in my hand was the only thing standing between the truth and a cover-up that would leave no survivors. I crawled toward the governor, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw my own partner from the precinct stepping out from the ranks of the intruders, his sidearm drawn. And he wasn't aiming at the attackers. He was aiming directly at me. The world slowed to a crawl, the chaotic symphony of shattering crystal and panicked screams fading into a dull, rhythmic thrumming in my ears. My partner, Sergeant Vance, a man I'd shared coffee and patrol routes with for 5 years, was standing less than 20 feet away. His face was a mask of cold, professional detachment, the muzzle of his service weapon leveled squarely at my chest. He wasn't looking at the governor, and he wasn't looking at the tactical team. His entire focus was on the small piece of plastic clutched in my hand. "Drop it, detective." Vance's voice was steady, void of the camaraderie we'd built over hundreds of midnight shifts. "You don't want to be a hero tonight. Nobody gets a medal for being dead in a ballroom." I felt the governor's daughter crouched beside me, her breath hitching, her hand gripping my blazer. I could feel the cold metal of the flash drive biting into my palm. It was the only tangible proof of the organized scheme, the only reason Miller had been bold enough to walk around with that file in his pocket. If I dropped it, the truth would be incinerated along with any chance of cleaning up the department. "Vance?" I called out, my voice sounding foreign even to me. "You're supposed to be on the other side of this. What did they promise you? A seat at the table? A way out?" Vance laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "They didn't promise anything, kid. They just reminded me who actually runs this city. You think the governor can stop the rot? He's just the face on the posters. The foundation is made of people like Miller and me. We're the ones who keep the gears turning." The tactical team was moving systematically through the ballroom, clearing the area of guests while the governor's personal detail desperately tried to form a barricade around him. The governor was shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the heavy, rhythmic thuds of boots on marble. My partner took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm not going to ask again," he hissed. "That drive doesn't belong to you. It's department property. Hand it over, and maybe I'll tell them you were just confused." I knew there was no maybe. If I handed that drive over, I was a ghost. I looked at the governor's daughter. She was watching me, her eyes wide, waiting to see if I would crumble or fight. She wasn't just a political figurehead's child. She was the architect of this confrontation. She'd known this might happen, and she had gambled everything on my reaction. I tightened my grip on the drive, then suddenly dived to my left, sliding behind a heavy marble pillar just as a gunshot cracked the air. The bullet shattered the plaster inches above my head, sending white dust raining down on my shoulders. I scrambled to my feet, lungs burning, and bolted toward the side exit, knowing that if I could make it to the parking garage, I might have a chance to disappear into the city. "Stop him!" Vance bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the service kitchen, dodging startled catering staff, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of spilled champagne and expensive perfume was replaced by the stale, metallic tang of the loading dock. I burst through the double doors into the cool night air, but I wasn't alone. 2 black SUVs were idling near the exit, their headlights cutting through the darkness like twin daggers. I saw a man step out of the lead vehicle. It was the precinct captain. He looked at me, then at the gun in his holster, his face showing a weary kind of disappointment that hit harder than any threat. "You shouldn't have run, Detective," the captain said, walking slowly toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "You're just a kid who doesn't understand how the world works. Miller was an idiot for acting out in public, but you're a problem that needs a quieter solution." I backed away until my heels hit the cold concrete of the perimeter wall. There was nowhere left to go. The captain signaled his men to move in, and I realized I had fallen into the trap that had been waiting for me all along. As the captain reached for his own weapon, he looked at me with a sickening, paternal pity. "You think you're holding the key to the truth?" he muttered, shaking his head. "Open that drive, kid. Look at what's really on it. Then you'll realize why you were chosen to be the one who found it." My hands were shaking, but I pulled the small device out. I needed to know. I fumbled in my pocket for the small emergency phone I carried, shoved the drive into the port, and tapped the screen. The display flickered to life, showing a directory of files. But it wasn't a list of criminal shipments or weapon manifests. It was a digital map of the entire governor's estate, paired with real-time audio feeds of his private office, and my name was listed as the primary operative in a blackmail dossier dating back 3 years. I wasn't the whistleblower, I was the setup. The flash drive was a plant, designed to frame me for the very organized scheme I was trying to uncover. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, not the police, but the internal security teams coming to arrest me for the governor's assassination, I heard a click behind me. I turned to see the governor's daughter standing there, her phone raised to her ear, a cold, unfeeling smile on her face. "He's got it," she said into the phone, her voice ice cold. "And he's exactly where we need him to be." The betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow could have. I stood there in the damp, freezing air of the loading dock, the glow of the screen reflecting off my bewildered face, while the governor's daughter stared at me with a chilling detachment that made my blood run cold. The innocent victim act she had played in the ballroom had been a masterclass in manipulation. She wasn't fighting for justice. She was choreographing a fall guy. "You really thought for even a second that you were the hero of this story?" she asked, her voice calm, almost melodic. She hung up the phone and tucked it back into her clutch, her posture perfect, her expression devoid of any human empathy. "You've spent 3 years being a clean cop, a nuisance to every power player in this city. You were the perfect candidate, independent, isolated, and just naive enough to think you could single-handedly take down a machine that you didn't even realize you were a part of." The captain stood a few feet away, a grim smile spreading across his face. He didn't even bother drawing his weapon anymore. He knew the trap had snapped shut. "We needed someone to take the heat for the chaos inside," he said, his voice gravelly. "The governor needs a scapegoat who has a documented history of disobeying orders. A disgruntled detective with a chip on his shoulder, caught with proof that he was the one leaking information to the radicals. It's a clean narrative for the press." The sirens were getting louder, the blue and red lights beginning to bleed over the top of the concrete walls. I was trapped between the truth I had discovered and the lie they had constructed around me. If I handed the drive over, I was guilty of being part of their group. If I destroyed it, I had no evidence to clear my name. I was standing in the middle of a perfect storm, and I was the lightning rod. "You're going to use me to cover up the entire organized scheme?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the approaching sirens. "You'll frame me for an attempt on your own father's life just to keep the status quo." "My father is a busy man," she replied, stepping closer, her eyes scanning the loading dock with clinical precision. "He does what he must to maintain order. If that requires sacrificing a pawn who thinks he's a knight, so be it. You have 30 seconds before the internal security team arrives. You can choose to run and be shot on sight for resisting arrest, or you can stand still, put your hands behind your head, and accept that your career and your life ended the moment you stepped into that ballroom." My brain was racing. I looked at the flash drive, then at the captain, then back at the girl. I realized then that the internal security team they were so afraid of wasn't the police. It was the actual, honest branch of the department that hadn't been corrupted. If they arrived and found me holding the drive, a device that clearly linked me to the blackmail files, I wouldn't stand a chance. I had to gamble. Without a word, I turned and bolted toward the shadows of the dumpster-filled alleyway. "Get him!" the captain roared, his composure finally shattering. Gunfire erupted, the sound muffled by the concrete walls, sparks flying as bullets pinged off the metal dumpsters. I dove behind a stack of crates, feeling a sharp burning sensation graze my shoulder. But I didn't stop. I clambered up a rusted fire escape, my breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps. Below me, I could hear them shouting, their voices echoing in the narrow alley. They weren't just trying to catch me, they were trying to silence me before I could reach anyone who would actually listen. I reached the roof, stumbling over the uneven gravel, and sprinted toward the edge. I was 3 stories up, with a drop into the dark, rain-slicked alley behind the building. I could see the internal security vehicles swarming the front of the complex now, their lights painting the night sky in frantic pulses. I had to reach them, but if I walked out there now, I'd be labeled an active threat. I pulled out my burner phone, the one I use for sensitive cases, and realized with a sinking heart that the battery was dead. I was stranded. I scrambled toward the roof access door, intending to head down the stairs, but it swung open before I could touch the handle. A figure stood in the doorway, blocking my path, silhouette illuminated by the flashing lights below. It was my partner, Vance. He hadn't followed the captain. He had anticipated my path. "Nowhere left to run, detective," he said, raising his weapon with a steady, practiced hand. "Give me the drive. I'll make it quick." I looked down at the dark alley, then at Vance. I had one desperate, reckless move left. I took the flash drive, gripped it tight, and leaped toward the fire escape of the adjacent building, missing the railing and slamming hard into the wall. As I dangled there by my fingertips, clinging to the rusty metal, Vance stepped to the edge of the roof, looking down at me with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You're falling," he said, leaning over the ledge, his gun pointed straight at my face. "Do you have any idea how many people are waiting for you to hit the ground?" Just as he prepared to pull the trigger, the roof access door behind him was kicked open by the internal security team, their rifles drawn and trained on him. But instead of arresting him, they raised their voices in a chilling unison. "Drop the weapon, detective. We have orders to neutralize the target." I looked up in horror. They weren't there to save me. They were there to finish the job. The governor's reach was wider than I had ever feared. I was truly, completely alone. I hung suspended in the abyss, the rusted metal of the fire escape groaning under my weight. Above me, the scene was a theater of the absurd. My own partner, Vance, staring down the barrels of the internal security team, and the team themselves standing ready to execute orders that had clearly been subverted from the very top. It was the ultimate betrayal. The institution I had sworn to protect had become a closed loop, a self-sustaining engine of corruption that would consume anyone who tried to stop it. But as I looked at the security team, I saw something that changed the equation. One of the officers, a man I'd mentored back in my first year, wasn't aiming at my head. His sights were trained on the governor's daughter, who had just stepped out onto the roof, her expression finally cracking into a mask of impatient rage. She signaled to the team, her hands sharp and demanding, but the officer, Marcus, didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on her, his finger trembling on the trigger. "The governor isn't here, is he?" Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the city. "We've been monitoring the perimeter. You gave the order to neutralize a fellow officer based on a fabricated file. That isn't policy, that's a hit." The tension snapped like a dry twig. Vance, realizing his leverage was vanishing, pivoted to aim at Marcus, but he was too slow. A single controlled shot rang out, not from the police or the tactical team, but from the darkness of the neighboring roof. Vance crumpled, clutching his shoulder, and the rooftop erupted into a chaotic standoff. I hauled myself over the railing, my shoulder burning from the bullet graze, and sprinted toward the center of the roof. I didn't head for the door. I headed for the small ventilation hub, where the building's server access was located. If I couldn't trust the people in front of me, I had to bypass them entirely. "Don't move!" the governor's daughter screamed, drawing a small, concealed pistol from her clutch. She wasn't just a bystander, she was the commander. I didn't stop. I jammed the flash drive into the maintenance port. It wasn't just a file store. It was a physical key that the precinct captain had mocked me about. The drive contained a dead man's switch, a script I had spent the last 6 months developing in secret, just in case my own investigations ever hit a wall. As the drive clicked into place, the building's communication array flickered, And suddenly, the digital billboards across the city, the ones flashing images of the gala, went black. Then they started broadcasting. It wasn't just the audio of the blackmail files. It was the live feed of the roof, the image of the governor's daughter standing there with her weapon drawn, and the record of every illicit communication between the precinct captain and the organized scheme. The entire city saw the betrayal in high definition. The governor's daughter froze, the light of the massive LED billboard across the street reflecting off her face, showing her image to millions. She realized then that the narrative had been hijacked. She tried to raise her weapon, but the internal security team, the ones who hadn't been bought, converged. "It's over," I said, my voice raspy as I slumped against the vent. "The stream is hitting every server in the state. You can't scrub this. You can't frame me for the death of a man who just confessed to treason on a public broadcast." She looked at the screens, her arrogance finally melting into a hollow, terrifying realization. She had played the game perfectly, but she had underestimated the one thing that couldn't be bought: the truth, once it was set free. The fallout was immediate and absolute. Within an hour, federal agents, not the compromised local units, stormed the governor's estate. By morning, the investigation into the organized scheme had expanded into a full-scale purge of the department. The precinct captain, the corrupt sergeants, and the governor himself were in custody before the sun cleared the horizon. I sat in the back of an ambulance, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the city wake up. The corruption hadn't just been a few bad apples. It was the entire orchard. But the cycle had been broken, at least for now. I had lost my badge, my partner, and the life I thought I was living. But as I looked down at my hands, they were finally clean. The governor's daughter was led past me in handcuffs, her face hidden behind her hair. She didn't look at me, but for a split second, I saw her lips move, a silent acknowledgement that she understood the cost of her failure. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a survivor of a war that had been fought in the shadows of my own home. I stood up, left the blanket on the bench, and began the long walk toward the train station. I wasn't a cop anymore, and I didn't want to be. I just wanted to be a person again, someone who could sleep at night without worrying about who was watching from the dark. As the first light of day hit the skyscrapers, I disappeared into the crowd, finally free from the reach of the people who thought they owned the world.